Let us kick off this big hour with one of the world's biggest companies making a big-time commitment, and that is Nvidia. Nvidia finally unveiling exactly where and when it's going to be investing hundreds of millions of dollars in American manufacturing. Dare we say it's not surprising that Nvidia would go ahead with a modified version. Nvidia's decision to close its domestic manufacturing lines and relocate production overseas marks a watershed moment in the global semiconductor industry. When Jensen Huang announced that tariff policies newly enacted by President Donald Trump left the company with no practical alternative, the reverberations were felt across boardrooms from Silicon Valley to Shanghai. China, the European Union, and Canada responded with their own sets of retaliatory duties, driving up the cost of importing American-made chips into the world's biggest markets. At the same time, US businesses found themselves overwhelmed by the prohibitive expense of sourcing overseas components given the levies imposed on foreign goods entering the United States. In this crucible of tit-for-tat protectionism, Nvidia chose to shift its production footprint abroad, setting in motion a strategic realignment with far-reaching consequences. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The announcement came just weeks after the new administration signed executive orders implementing 50% tariffs on all semiconductor imports from key trade partners. While these measures were intended to bolster domestic manufacturing and preserve American jobs, the reality of global supply chains quickly exposed the inherent contradictions of such an approach. Semiconductor fabrication relies on an intricate network of foundries, raw material suppliers, equipment manufacturers, and specialized logistics providers scattered across multiple continents. Attempting to reorganize that network swiftly within US borders proved not only cost prohibitive but logistically infeasible. Nvidia's own plants in Texas and California had come online only recently, boasting cutting-edge equipment that represented billions in sunk costs. Yet the new tax on finished chips rendered those facilities economically untenable almost overnight. In the days leading to the announcement, Nvidia executives had been scrambling to model scenarios under varying tariff structures. Internal projections showed that manufacturing in Taiwan or Malaysia, where many of Nvidia's peers already have deep-rooted operations, would become more profitable. The combined effect of reduced input costs, streamlined export channels, and avoidance of cross-border levies created a stark contrast with mounting overheads back home. It was only a matter of weeks before Hang, in a press release devoid of diplomatic hedging, acknowledged the company's strategic pivot. Production would be consolidated in existing overseas fabs capable of scaling rapidly, while US facilities would be wound down in phases over the coming months. Observers across the industry noted the irony. A policy designed to protect American high-tech prowess spurred one of its leading innovators to decamp to foreign shores. Nvidia's chips power everything from gaming consoles to artificial intelligence platforms, and the company had long been hailed as an exemplar of American ingenuity. That standing now collided headfirst with the realities of global commerce. Suppliers of silicon wafers in Japan, equipment manufacturers in Germany, and assembly houses in South Korea suddenly found themselves central to the fate of an American titan. This rearrangement threatened to dilute the United States' influence over a strategic sector as key technological know-how, jobs, and capital shifted beyond its borders, beyond the immediate financial calculus. The announcement underscored deeper geopolitical undercurrents. Trade policy has become an instrument of national security, with leaders framing economic decoupling as a means to stymie rivals. Yet, when sanctions and counter-sanctions escalate too far, they risk triggering a spiral in which no one emerges unscathed. For Nvidia, whose revenue depends heavily on sales in Asia and Europe, the retaliatory duties imposed by those regions were not merely a political statement, but a direct attack on the bottom line. The company's CFO had cautioned that profit margins would be squeezed by as much as 20% if forced to absorb those costs or pass them along to customers. Faced with the choice between stifling growth and relocating production where goods could move tariff-free, the decision became starkly clear. Meanwhile, domestic customers of Nvidia's technology, ranging from startups building edge computing devices to defense contractors developing autonomous systems, had to confront their own dilemmas. Should they hedge by securing supply from alternative foundries or risk paying exorbitant prices for domestic production? The added complexity of managing split supply chains threatened to slow development cycles and inflate unit costs. Founding teams in Silicon Valley and Boston recalculated their burn rates, questioning whether to delay hardware launches until the trade environment stabilized. Even companies fortunate enough to have inventory stockpiled faced the specter of sudden shortages if US output was shuttered prematurely. This two-off war also spilled over into regulatory deliberations. Lawmakers on Capitol Hill, already embroiled in broader debates over national competitiveness, convened emergency hearings to assess the fallout. Proposals emerged to carve out semiconductor production from the tariff regime or to offer targeted tax relief and subsidies to offset the punitive duties. Yet such remedies risked undermining the administration's broader trade posture, sowing discord within the ruling coalition. On one side, protectionist voices insisted that any concessions would embolden foreign producers and abandon the commitment to domestic jobs. On the other, free trade proponents warned that absolutist stances on tariffs would drive away precisely the industries the policy aimed to save. As Nvidia's former US factories entered decommissioning phases, the human cost became salient. Communities in Oregon, Texas, and New York, home to wafer fabrication lines and testing labs, grappled with sudden layoffs and diminished economic activity. Workers with specialized skill sets faced uncertain prospects in a landscape where foreign plants were expanding instead. Local governments scrambled to attract new investment, dangling incentives and workforce retraining programs. Yet, the magnetism of established overseas ecosystems proved formidable. The very notion of reshoring advanced semiconductor manufacturing, once championed as an attainable goal, began to look like a decade-long endeavor rather than an immediate solution. Beyond employment metrics, the move raised questions about intellectual property safeguards. Nvidia's design processes, research findings, and proprietary methods had thrived under robust legal frameworks in the United States. Operating in jurisdictions where enforcement of trade secrets and patent rights may vary introduces new risks. To mitigate exposure, Nvidia planned to erect parallel R&D centers with stringent cybersecurity and access controls. Even so, the shift of production workflows created points of vulnerability as data traveled across more international nodes. Shareholders mulled whether the company's promises of maintaining innovation leadership could persist under the altered structure. The broader semiconductor landscape, too, adjusted its trajectory. Companies once content to follow Nvidia's supply chain blueprint began reassessing their own facilities. Rival chipmakers examined the trade maps and calculated that expanding in Southeast Asia or Eastern Europe offered superior resilience against geopolitical upheaval. Equipment suppliers redirected sales efforts toward those regions, foreseeing growth in new fabs and packaging plants. Logistics firms optimized routes away from the US heartland, anticipating a reorientation of point-to-point flows. Investors attuned to the perils of concentrated supply, diversified portfolios to include specialized infrastructure funds tied to emerging manufacturing hubs overseas. Academic institutions and think tanks seized upon the episode to debate the merits of economic nationalism versus integration. Conferences convened panels to dissect the unintended consequences of blanket tariffs, highlighting how interdependence had become a defining feature of modern industrial ecosystems. Policy papers argued for nuanced approaches, strategic tariffs paired with reciprocal market access, targeted subsidies coupled with workforce development, and multilateral dialogues to establish clearer trade rules. Yet, as Nvidia's own pivot illustrated, the window for gradual adjustment may be closing in, an age of rapid technology diffusion and intensifying great power competition. International partners, for their part, interpreted Nvidia's move through varied lenses. Governments in Taiwan and South Korea, with established semiconductor clusters, welcomed the infusion of new orders and capital investment. Local officials hailed the decision as a vindication of their industrial strategies, which had long prioritized cluster building, talent cultivation, and public-private collaboration. Analysts in Brussels and London noted that Europe too must accelerate its own chip sovereignty efforts lest it be relegated to a mere assembly outpost. Even Canada, which had initially protested US tariffs, began courting displaced talent, promoting its stable policy environment and proximity to the American market as advantages. From the vantage of global supply chain architects, the Nvidia case became a cautionary tale about the limits of political muscle flexing. Tariffs by design reconfigure flows of goods, but they cannot instantly recreate manufacturing bases or substitute interline ecosystems. The chips produced in one territory depend on precursor chemicals, lithography machines, packaging materials, and skilled operators. Building all that domestically requires not only capital, but also years of ecosystem development, from university programs to sophisticated distribution networks. Nvidia's overseas partners had already fostered that complexity. Attempting to replicate it on home soil in a matter of months met insurmountable logistical barriers. As Nvidia set about reorganizing its global footprint, questions surfaced about the long-term consequences for research collaboration and cross-border talent mobility. The company's engineers had thrived in a milieu where projects hopped seamlessly between campuses in California, labs in Munich, and testing centers in Singapore. New constraints on material transfers and travel restrictions threatened to fragment those workflows. To preserve agility, Nvidia proposed virtualized design environments with encrypted cloud platforms, allowing dispersed teams to work on unified code bases without handling physical prototypes. This digital pivot represented an acknowledgement that physical production could relocate even as intellectual collaboration sought to transcend borders. The decision also cast a spotlight on the strategic calculus of corporate citizenship. Nvidia, historically celebrated for its contributions to local economies and philanthropic endeavors, now faced criticism from certain quarters for abandoning the US manufacturing heartland. Wong responded by emphasizing the company's continued investments in American R&D, education initiatives, and infrastructure projects. Consumers and enterprise buyers may come to value these certifications as much as origin claims, viewing them as proxies for both performance and ethical benchmarks. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us what are your thoughts on Nvidia moving abroad after Trump's tariffs? What happens next? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.